When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers!
Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figure it out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 40p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.
Hey Lilburn, exciting changes are coming to your Walmart at 4004 Lawrenceville Highway Northwest. Soon shopping will be easier than ever with improvements across the store. Stop by departments like produce, cosmetics, home, and more to get a glimpse of the upgrades. Plus, you'll still find the low prices you can trust every day on groceries, pharmacy needs, apparel, and more. Your newly remodeled Walmart will be ready on May 13th at 4004 Lawrenceville Highway Northwest in Lilburn. Save money, live better. Walmart.
Welcome to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast, your source for solutions-focused dialogue about race in America, with your host, Scott Speed.
Hello, and welcome to the RaceHaven Radio Show and Podcast. This is solutions-focused dialogue about race in America. My name is Scott Speed, and I am the facilitator of the dialogue. This is episode 12 of RaceHaven, and today I am joined by 2 regular contributors to the dialogue, Montoya Smith and John Costino. Montoya Smith is the founder of the Mental Dialogue community, and John Costino is the founder, CEO of MoneyWise LLC. Today we are going to have an open dialogue about race in America and address some of the things that stand in the way of progress, and then we will close out with our solution segment, where we do our best to suggest solutions to the topics we address during the show. So to start out each show that's going to be a dialogue where I have a panel of guests, I like to start out by discussing what is dialogue. And the reason I like to do that is because dialogue, in a traditional sense, in the way that is normally talked about in the public, is not traditional dialogue, or what I like to say is authentic dialogue. And authentic dialogue, has several tenets, of which the two that I want to, one that I want to share with you is in dialogue, one submits one's best thinking, expecting that other people's reflections will help improve it rather than threaten it. Let me say that one more time clearly. In dialogue, one submits one's best thinking, expecting that other people's reflections will help improve it rather than threaten it. Now, to contrast that, in debate, one submits one's best thinking and defends it against challenge to show that it is right. So one of the things that we try to facilitate on this podcast is dialogue, which goes against what we see in the media, both news media and social media, where we see a lot of debating going on. And I personally believe that dialogue is at the core root of the solutions, of getting to the solutions that we want to see in society. With that being said, RaceHaven is a safe place for people from diverse ethnic, religious, cultural, and political backgrounds to bring their race-based perspectives, questions, assumptions, frustrations, and experiences to engage in thoughtful, honest dialogue in an effort to transcend race in America. So here's the framework for authentic dialogue on this podcast. Participants listen with a sense of curiosity to ask questions to uncover the underlying assumptions and beliefs behind someone's statements. Number 2, participants are willing to communicate their thoughts openly and honestly while putting aside emotions, defensiveness, and a desire to be right. And number 3, participants approach someone who sees a problem differently, not as an adversary, but as a colleague in common pursuit of better solutions. So, welcome to the dialogue. So I want to introduce you to our 2 guests this morning. Let's see how they're doing. Montoya and John, are you guys with me?
I certainly am, sir.
Yeah, I'm here with
awesome.
Scott.
Montoya.
Awesome. How you doing today, Montoya?
Doing great, brother.
Good. Thanks for joining me today. And John, how are you?
Doing wonderful, sir. And yourself?
I am doing well. I appreciate you taking time out, both of you, out of your busy schedules, to entrepreneurs who are working hard to not only make a difference through their entrepreneurial work, but their entrepreneurial work is literally a platform for them to make a difference. So I appreciate both of you coming on and helping to share and make a difference through this platform as well. So we have our framework for our dialogue today. And, I'm really excited to get into this and more or less just want to see where it goes. I know that when we have a meeting of the minds, such as you two, that, this is going to be a really enriching dialogue for our audience to hear. And both Montoya, if you could tell our listeners, because this is a show based on race, I believe that your race is important in terms of adding context for our listeners. So Montoya, if you could tell our listeners where you're from and what your ethnicity is, that would be appreciated.
Yes, I am from Honey Pass, South Carolina. Originally, I'm in Atlanta now, and I'm African American.
Awesome. And John, could you please do the same?
Certainly. I'm originally from South Jersey. I am Italian, Irish, European American descent, and I now live in Southwest Florida.
Awesome. I appreciate it. So, and for the listeners, just in case, it's funny, I just realized that I ask our guests to do this on the show each week, and I never do it. I never do it. I never tell our listeners what my ethnicity is and where I'm from. And, that's kind of an assumption that people wouldn't know, but that's a false assumption because there's going to be people who listen to this podcast who don't know. So I'll share with everyone that I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and my ethnicity is African American, and I currently live in Fairburn, Georgia, which is right outside of Atlanta. So that's all of our backgrounds. That's a little context that will help everyone kind of understand our backgrounds and where we're coming from. And so let's jump into it. I want to start out with this dialogue with throwing out a topic for you gentlemen to chew on. And I guess I want to start with John because John recently reached out to me and he shared a meme with me and expressed how this meme was something that was, I guess it hit a button with him in terms of some of the things that frustrate him about some of the things that happen in social media. And as we know, a lot of our society's, I guess, ills and progress and everything plays out on social media nowadays, which is actually, in my opinion, pretty cool because we get to kind of see into the thoughts and mindsets of a large range of people like we've never had an opportunity to do before. Whereas before, the traditional media was driving the narrative, where now the people drive the narrative. So I think that's a good thing. So anyway, with that being said, there was a meme that came across John's timeline. And he immediately shot it over to me and was like, Scott, this is a part of the problem right here. So there was an African-American gentleman, I assume, man or woman, who posted this meme. It says this: 400 years later, and black people still think white people are going to have a change of heart. So, John, would you please provide us with some insights into what chord did that meme strike with you?
Well, thanks so much, Scott. And obviously, we spoke about it when I sent it to you. And, I'm going to try to be very careful with my words because I think that's one of the big challenges is that, so many people speak out of an emotion without really thinking it through. And I haven't looked at it since sending it to you. So hearing it again, it does. It creates that same feeling inside. And, the first thing that comes to my mind is it's such an assumption that now casts that message on every, as it says in there, white or Caucasian person, of which I am. So it obviously wasn't posted out of love. Obviously, something most likely happened that was negative, whether it was a very ignorant person that did or said something that would trigger an individual to post that. It now is a blanket statement on every, as they posted, white person that now is going to be judged by it. So to me, we've talked about this. I don't see people in color. I really don't. I know people think that's a joke, but I don't. I see people for their actions. I recognize ignorance. I recognize selfishness. I recognize violence. Those are things that you can recognize very easily with people. And I feel comfortable saying that on the radio show with you because you've known me long enough to have made a judgment on me of whether or not that's a really a true statement or whether I'm just somebody saying those things. So to read that, to sum up my feelings, those are the types of statements made by anyone, whether it's African American, Caucasian American, Asian American, doesn't matter. Those are the kind of statements that keep us very divided, and that division only fosters potential anger and violence. It doesn't even remotely give us the chance to start focusing on solutions and healing and coming together. So it's a long answer to your question, but that's really kind of how it feels.
Okay. And really quick, John, did you happen to read any of the comments under that when you saw that meme, or did you just look at the meme?
No, on purpose I didn't, because I try to distance myself from the things that used to just fuel the anger and the frustration. Believe me, I used to be as angry as anybody, but I made the choice a long time ago. It wasn't going to be very productive, and it certainly wasn't going to help me to provide solutions. So, no, I on purpose did not even read any of the comments.
Okay. All right. So, Montoya, what are your thoughts when you see a meme like that?
Yeah, I definitely saw the meme. I think I even commented on it because I placed it on the RaceHaven Facebook page. And while I absolutely respect where John is coming from, I actually understand how, in looking at it, as he said, to a certain extent, it can fuel some level of anger because, as he said, it's a blanketed statement. When I look at the meme, though, I think about and understand where it's coming from. When I say understand where it's coming from, I mean that in the sense that it's actually coming from it's directed. And I think, as John said, something may have happened that triggered that meme to be put in place. I think that's also a fair statement by him as well. But when I think about exactly where that meme comes from, I'm able to contextualize it in the sense that it's actually coming from a small minority of a very small minority within the African American community, and the meme is being addressed to, as it said, because it's a blanket statement not only on whites. I don't know if you realize it, John, but it's actually a blanket statement towards blacks because, again, it's coming from a small minority of blacks who are saying to other blacks, but in generalizing that for the most part, the majority of blacks actually believe that there's going to be a change of heart because this person who's spewing anger or spewing some level of racial hatred from their perspective. But again, Scott, I think you would agree, being African American, you and I have not just this meme, but we're very aware of this small segment of African Americans who, in turn, have racial prejudice towards whites and propagate things of this nature. And we both know that it's an incredibly small minority, but quite often highlighted in this manner as a concern by whites is from the standpoint of, or a lot of African Americans thinking this, well, the reality is the reason why this person is even putting this meme up is to try to say to other blacks, stop believing that there's going to be a change of heart, because at the end of the day, the majority of us do not feel as this person feels, and they're trying to propagate, this type of racial hatred, which is kind of equivalent in the white community in the sense, if we're going to talk about it, just from a black and white standpoint, that the equivalent in the white community is this small minority of whites who still pass on racial hatred as well. And so, that meme, for example, would be like pointing to something in a sense that a racist KKK person might put up and believing that the majority of whites will take on what that KKK person would put up, whatever thought they may profess. So I'm just basically able to contextualize, and again, you and I both understand that this is coming from a small minority of blacks that don't have the influence that if I can say this directly to you, John, that don't actually have the influence. If it was as simple as getting rid of it, then I would turn around and say, well, let's stamp out the KKK or racist whites that we know exist as easily as we could, as much as we want to. And that's something that for those of us who are trying to reach some level of racial harmony, we would like to, but at the same time, are we always taking steps to stamp out that minority, in the sense, as they move and in a sense in our country have a right to say what they want, what steps do we actually take to stamp them out?
So let me well, one thing that you said, Montoya, that I appreciate was that not only is it generalizing European Americans, but it's also generalizing, African Americans. So John, when you read that, did you read it in the sense that that's do you think that's a sentiment that a majority of African American people hold, or do you immediately identify it as it's a small minority? As Montoya said, it's a small minority of African American people that hold those feelings. When you see something like that, how does it sit with you?
No, I agree with Montoya 100%. I appreciate hearing his perspective. Again, I have a very unique, let's say, experience in that, Scott, my last 30 years, I've been, in a very public environment working across every demographic in our country. So I don't have that knee-jerk reaction that the average person might have. I don't on any level think that message is believed or echoed by the masses. In fact, I believe it's the exact opposite. I believe it's they call it the minority groups, but they're the outspoken, loudest segment of society in each little demographic. And I think it's a small group. I think it's a very, I don't want to say ignorant, but I don't know what other word to use, because I would term that, as Montoya said, with a very, white supremacist KKK group. I would call that just as ignorant. And it just seems that these small groups scream the loudest, and the rest of us, for the most part, don't respond, don't say anything. So the outspoken minority ends up making the loudest voice. That's why when I sent it to you, I said I would love to have that be a part of the Race Haven Solutions dialogue, because as Montoya said, we can't eradicate things completely, but we could make a louder voice focusing on solutions and, working together and living together in harmony versus trying to keep things divided and in conflict.
Okay. Well, very, very interesting. As we dialogue over these things, and we've had this show, this is the 12th episode, and we've been on, we've had our Facebook group, Race Haven, for almost 2 years now. And, this dialogue has progressed. And, what we're talking about right now is really operating, as you guys have already stated, kind of at the lowest level of consciousness and awareness in terms of, race-based issues in America. We have this I'm going to call it ignorant minority that, like John says, they tend to get the most publicity, that, they spew these things. And the reality is it's not a representation of how, I would say most people, feel or think. So my question is, there's.
Hey Scott, if I could, real quick,
go ahead.
Let me jump in. I don't know if I think this may facilitate some dialogue, and let's address this minority from both perspectives. This ignorant minority. This is something that I'll quite often venture out to say. I'll give a little background for how I come to this conclusion, and people can do their research to figure out if they think I'm right or wrong or whatever. But again, this is from a lot of my own research. And I'll try to give a short version of it. But whereas we're easily able to say that the loudest people are this small minority in the context of, as we in the specific meme, we're talking about the minority within the African American community, and because it talks about black and white, we'll still keep it in that context. And we say that there's racial supremacy groups, which we can obviously say that they exist within African American community as well as in the European American community. We both know they exist. What I think that tends to happen when we speak of this minority, we speak of this minority in a way and I think ignorant is the correct word, John, by the way, but we speak of this minority as if to kind of dismiss them in this little corner without having a perspective of in them being the loudest. Do they actually have an opportunity to affect, in a sense, the rest of us? And so here's a guesstimate from me, based on some research, of what that small minority is in Black America or White America. I know those are terms you stray away from, Scott. But anyway, I'll say it to say this. So, in my opinion, based on National Opinion Research Center, which does a survey on all type of things, demographics and race and all type of things, it's been doing it it's done it every year since 1972, except for 2 years or whatever. This big survey that they've done, it's done out of, like I said, the Chicago Research Center or whatever. It's the premier research center in the country. The government actually looks at this to study different things, or even sometimes even look at it before making some types of policy. The different politicians will look at this research, again, because it's the comprehensive research throughout the country. A lot of people are unaware of this. But there's just one aspect of it that has been going down every year since 1972, and that aspect has been whether or not someone would be comfortable or would believe, in the sense that, sell their home to someone of a different race. And this number now is down to about 28%, and it's been coming down every year since 1972, which is a good thing. You know, we know over time the kids are much better than us. They don't see the things that we try to put into the kids or they historically have been put in, so they become better than us. So it makes sense that number would go down. But if you put that number in context, I also equate to say that those are the people who are, you know, when surveyed properly, not a biased survey. People tend to say, well, the survey was probably biased. But, again, this is being done by the premier research center in the country, who's always, you know, improving their questions to the extent that they try to take out people leaning one way or the other as best as possible. So with that said, that number to me equates to about 30% of the country who still has, in my opinion, holds very racist opinions, in the sense that they said I shouldn't have to sell to someone else. Not that the government will make them sell. A lot of times when I use that word should, people want to contextualize it and think that I mean that the government's going to make someone sell. No, they're just not wanting to. So I contend that about 30% of the country that still holds these racial feelings. So that minority, it shows that the majority of the country is not that way. But when you contextualize that into the different groups, for example, whites and African Americans, that number for whites, if it is in fact 30%, that's still double all of African Americans altogether. And so when we reduce this minority over to the corner as somebody who's dismissive that we all dislike, without realizing that that small minority actually could seem like a bigger number to a minority group than it actually is. So as African Americans who are worried about how whites see us, and we look to the racists or whatever things that they may do in their lifetime to be racial towards us as African Americans, we in perspective, we think that there's more whites than it really is that are racist. But on the flip side, whites think, no, that's a small minority. It's a very small group. But now that small group is still big enough to affect all of African Americans in certain areas. So I don't know if what I just said makes sense.
Yeah. Go ahead. So let me jump in there. So basically, Montoya, what you're saying is, and I hear you, and I've heard this, read this from you before, and I appreciate this perspective. It actually helps me conceptualize things, and I love looking at it this way. So basically what you're saying is, through this research, about 30% of European Americans still would not sell their homes to an African American or some other minority, because I'm going to assume that the sentiment is we don't want those type of people in our neighborhood, right? That's kind of that sentiment. So in that sense, we're like, okay, well, 30% is not that bad. That's a small minority of European Americans. It's only 30% of them. That means 70% of European Americans are, forward thinking. They've moved beyond, that type of small-mindedness. And that's a great thing. But then on the flip side, because European Americans make up 70+% of the country in total population, and African Americans make up 12%, that 30% of European Americans still doubles the total number of African Americans in this country. So with that being said, when African Americans are feeling this perceived discrimination, this perceived hatred, this perceived, racism against them from a segment of European Americans, where a lot of people may think to themselves, well, it's only a small minority of European Americans who are still have those thoughts and feelings. As African Americans, we're still encountering that small minority, because when you compare numbers to numbers, they still outweigh African Americans. So I think that's a very interesting point. That's something that a lot of people, I think a lot of people processing that information, it will inform a lot of their thoughts and ideas and about race in America. John, what do you think about what Montoya just shared?
Well, I can totally respect the perspective, and I understand the thought process, but where I'll say I differ is I don't really think that the problem comes from the percentage or the numbers, and I'll just use a very obvious, statement. You could take an environment, and we can say it's an African American environment that has 3, ignorant racists invaded, or a European American environment that has 3 ignorant African American racists invaded. Can we agree that it could be 300 people in church, whether it's African Americans in church or European Americans in church, and 3 ignorant people come in with guns and create havoc? It has nothing to do with the percentages. It has to do with the tonality. It has to do with the intentions. It has to do with the lack of respect. It has to do with the ignorance. All those things, in my mind, I'm not saying I'm right, but my perspective is it's not about the percentages anymore. It's about, and again, yeah, it's great, believe me, better today than it was 50 and better than 100 years ago, but we still have to, on both sides of the coin, say we're not going to tolerate it from our own demographic, from our own race, from our own ethnicity. We have to make a stand. And I think that's the problem, is apathy in this country is the biggest challenge. You know what? It's not my problem, is what people think, until it happens in their town or it happens to someone they care about. That's why I love this, format that you've created, Scott, because at least for you and I, it gives us a chance to dialogue. We're, 500 miles apart, but we do share a lot of the same philosophies. We both have very solutions-focused mentalities. And, I believe from our conversations, we both want the same ultimate goal for our children. And listening to Montoya, I loved hearing him say that. For me, it's all about what can we do to improve the next generation, not continue to facilitate the mistakes of our great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, and even mistakes that we made ourselves. How do we improve it for our kids?
Okay, Scott, can I say one thing, too, because I like the perspective that he just offered. I want to show him a difference that is a reality right now still in America. If he thinks different, if he thinks it's something different, I would love to hear this. So is it okay for me to? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So I respect what you're saying, that it's not about the percentages, if you want to differ in that sense. But here's another reality to the very percentages that we're talking about. When as you and I both have kind of said, we want to address that small minority. What are we actually doing about that small minority? But the example that you just gave, here's another reality of that small minority. Let's go ahead and assume that 30% exists in African Americans too. Let's just make that for the sake of this conversation. But here's the difference, John. The difference is when you say let's stamp it out in our own racial groups per se. Well, here's the difference of what we're stamping out. You don't have actions that equate to within the African Americans, let's say if there is 30% of African Americans who believe in black supremacy, let's say that. But right now we don't have any actions that equate to the actions that we see coming from the minority of white Americans that are actually equating actions that lead to the racial disharmony that we speak of. So whereas you say, well, let's track down the person who made that meme and say this is ridiculous. That's a minimal result compared to the example that you gave. We have a real life example, unfortunately, of I don't never say the guy's name. I never believe in saying mass shooter's name, but the young man that goes into the church in Charleston, for example. You don't have those type of actions. And then the other thing is, with that small minority, the reason that I think that percentage is important is based on the history of this country. Unfortunately, there are minimum acts. I'm not talking about something as such as a shooter walking into a church, for example. I'm talking about there are very minimal acts that are backed up by the structural racism that exists based on the history of this country. So there are small actions such as when you get into housing discrimination and things of those natures. That's something that's been very prevalent in our country really up until about 10 years ago, and we still are having examples of it, but most people don't know how prevalent housing discrimination was. So if you have those type of biases, if you're in that 30%, or if you're a manager and you're in that 30%, a small bias can play out in who gets a promotion or where somebody lives because you're not showing all of the apartments. So there are actually actions. So while I would agree with you, both groups should do something, I don't know if you really have any actions from the minority of African Americans who feel this way. Do you have any actions that they are doing that are anywhere close to the equivalent of that 30% within the European American community if we stick with those numbers?
Okay, so let me jump in. I appreciate both of those perspectives, and based on what I'm hearing, an example that John gave about the three walking into a church, no matter the same three walking into a church that are African American versus European American, taking that act is still the same, and you got to stomp those people out. But what I hear Montoya speaking to is that the structural effects of European Americans who are racist. Let's just call it that. So let me expand on that and saying the fact that if a European American is racist because of the structural and historical impacts of race and power in this country, they have more power to take certain actions that will hurt a lot of African Americans, more so than three African Americans who are racist being able to take actions that will hurt a lot of Europeans. And when I'm speaking of action, I'm not talking about an extreme action like someone walking into a church and taking out a gun. Yeah, it doesn't matter what your race is. You can go in and take those actions and hurt people. But in terms of the structural hurting people in a way that impacts generations, that's where racism comes in, and structural racism, et cetera, et cetera. So I think at this time it'd be a good time for me to interject with the definition of racism as explained by sociologists, and then that will lead us into the concept of reverse racism, and I want to address both of those. So first, I want to talk about racism. So racism refers to a host of practices, beliefs, social relations, and phenomenon that work to reproduce a racial hierarchy and social structure that yields superiority and privilege for some and discrimination and oppression for others. Racism takes representational, ideological, discursive, interactional, institutional, structural, and systemic forms. Despite its forms, at its core, racism is constituted by essentialist racial categories that turn human subjects into stereotyped objects, and then uses those stereotypes to justify and reproduce a racial hierarchy and racially structured society that limits access to resources, rights, and privileges on the basis of race. Okay, now, I know that's a lot, and it's very academic. However, I think that it's necessary for I think one of the most necessary things for us to move forward in these racial conversations is for Americans to agree what racism even means. okay? And the definition I just gave you is totally different than what I hear the way people refer to racism in common conversations. When in common conversations, people think that racism is simply spewing hatred. So no matter your race, if you say something that's hateful towards someone of another race, that's what racism is. That's what being racist is. No matter your race, if you do something hateful or mean, then you're displaying racism or supporting racism, etc. That's the traditional, for whatever reason, the way we've all grown to think, of racism. However, sociologists, academics, what I just explained is how they define racism, and within that context, only European Americans can be racist, okay? Or only European Americans can be racist against minorities. But here's the flip side to that. Also, also minorities can be racist against other minorities. However, this is where people get, upset or confused, and this is where a lot of conversations break down when people hear me say this based on the research. The concept of reverse racism actually doesn't exist as presented by sociologists and academics, meaning minorities cannot be racist against European Americans because of the power dynamics. Can minorities be prejudiced against European Americans? Yes. Can they be bigoted against European Americans? Yes. But can they be racist against European Americans? No. And can minorities be racist against other minorities? Yes. If they do things and take actions that support the race-based systems that are in place, then they can support those things and be racist against other minorities as well. So finally, before I let you guys weigh in, I want to give you the concept of reverse racism and what the sociologists say about that. It says, for reverse racism or racism against whites to exist in the U.S., we would first have to reach racial equality in systemic and structural ways. We would have to pay reparations to make up for centuries upon centuries of unjust impoverishment. We would have to equalize wealth distribution and achieve equal political representation. We would have to see equal representation across all job sectors and educational institutions. We would have to abolish racist policing, judicial and incarceration systems, and we would have to eradicate ideological, interactional, and representational racism. Then and only then might people of color be in a position to limit access to resources, rights, and privileges on the basis of whiteness, which is to say reverse racism does not exist in the United States. So to give credit to who wrote this is actually one of our former guests on Race Haven, Dr. Nikki Lisa Cole. She's a PhD and a sociologist. So, and this information can be found at about.com's education section, which a link to this can be found on the Race Haven Facebook group. And I'll also post it in the show notes to this show on RaceHavenBlog.com when this show goes live. So with that being said, John, I want to have you weigh in on that initially, and then Montoya weigh in on the concepts of racism and what you believe it to be and what you think about what Dr. Cole stated, and then the concept of reverse racism based on what Dr. Cole stated. And please, and I know I shared a lot, but if you could start out by saying what you came into this conversation thinking those things to be, and then telling us what you think about what I just read, that would be great.
Sure, and I think it's a really great, let's say, we're like pulling the curtain back, because I think it's a great way to lay out there, and I'll agree 100%, that when we take a look at our history in this country, which is only a couple hundred years old, there's no comparison, and anyone that would dispute this is just clueless. There's no way that I could ever say, that I understand, let alone that I have been discriminated against or whatever, compared to those in the African American community. It's a given. That's the baseline. There's a tremendous imbalance in our history. Now, that being said, we as a society have used the term racism, as you just very clearly stated, improperly. So, yeah, I came in like everybody else using, the mindset of racism is one thing when technically using those definitions we're clearly off base. So I'm trying to say this intelligently and not sound ignorant, because we're all ignorant if we had that mindset that racism was just really more prejudice, ignorance, spewing hatred. But that being said, Scott, honestly, I would simply change the semantics, because for me, the history is important. It's extremely important that we do not repeat the history, but the present, what we're dealing with right now in our society, what we're seeing in the media, what the media is controlling and altering, whatever we're going to call that, it is creating the racial divide. It's creating the conflict. It's creating the anger. And so we don't need to call it racism, but to me, that is a very real and present danger to what you're trying to accomplish, what Montoya and I are here hoping to facilitate, which is bringing some clarity and some, what's the word I want to focus on here, some solution-based results. But yeah, the idea that a white guy like me of European descent to try to say, I understand what you've gone through or what your family history has experienced is crazy. And no, to Montoya's point, we're never going to be able to say that there was equality or there was fairness throughout history. My hope is that we can quickly accelerate that and get us to a point where we're not pointing to the past, but recognizing that it was a huge, horrific mistake and just wrong on every level, but not to try to tip the scales the other way, but just to bring true, honest, fair equality today. That's what my perspective is.
That makes sense. And I just think it's important for people to understand, the difference. And where some people may say, oh, it's just semantics, I think it's important for people to understand the difference, because personally, I think that systemic racism, or just racism in itself, is the biggest issue versus what's in people's as individuals' hearts. Because if people can start to see the systemic things that are the problem, then we can really get to solutions. Because in my estimation, we'll never be able to change what's in everyone's hearts. There's going to be some people who are always going to have hateful thoughts and beliefs, but on a systemic level, from a policy standpoint, governmental standpoint, we have to balance the scales. And I think in order for that to happen, we have to come to an understanding on what racism is, and stop letting these media-driven narratives about prejudice and bigotry and all those things cloud the truth of what racism is, so that we can truly get to that and start eliminating those different levels of systemic racism. So Montoya, go ahead and jump in, Montoya.
Absolutely. Great definitions. Glad you brought them to the table. John Stewart said it best. He said, our country has done a great job of stating that racism is bad, but we've done a terrible job of stating what racism is. And due to that, due to these misunderstood definitions that are prevalent throughout our country, we got to get these type of podcasts out and available for these thoughts to get out there. But another simple way of defining what you just said, and I know you're very familiar with this, Dr. George DeGrasse, who simply says that racism is an action that adversely affects an entire group or a large portion of a group. That's, in a sense, that's what racism is. And so if you just use that term, that kind of simplifies everything that you just read, because here's the reality. Whereas we're, on this podcast seeking out, and it starts with people like yourself, Scott, to even do what we're doing right now. While we're seeking it out, and the people who may choose to listen to this, they may tune in and listen to your long definitions from the doctor that you just read or whatever. I was fortunate able to read that piece that you sent, which had all those definitions in it. It is accurate, but we definitely have to be able to simplify it if we want the masses, in a sense, to be even to begin to conceptualize what racism actually is. Because one point you mentioned, well, I don't know where these definitions came from. Well, here's another reality when we're willing to look at history and speak to it from a realistic standpoint and own that history. Well, when you simply look up the word racism, you're going to see the definitions that we see them as now. It'll be something that simply says or states racial superiority, and so boom, we have a definition. Well, the reality of where that definition comes from, when you figure out where the dictionary was started, where it was written, and where it comes from, well, it's no different in opening up a high school history book and not seeing groups represented fairly within a history book. So you have to actually own up to that definitions within a dictionary, unfortunately, can fall under narratives that were created for 300, 400 years ago. And so that simplified definition that just says racism is having hatred for another group or something, as simple as that. And people will say, well, that's the definition, so let's go for that. I mean, we've seen people on RaceHaven say, where is this new definition of racism coming from? Because of what the dictionary says. Well, but if you actually go to the root word of ism, then you're talking about a system or a belief which speaks to what you're talking about, that we have to actually address the systematic aspect. But here's another difficult aspect of even dealing with that, whereas I think you're absolutely correct. The easy route is if people say, Scott, you're right, and what you say makes sense. What happens is, I think people will have a tendency, if they actually listen to you, and I think the way that you do this, people will, but people will still have a tendency, and it's just human nature, to detach themselves from what role individuals can play in that system approach. But again, we do have to first and foremost start there, because again, there is no position in which we as African Americans can adversely affect whites. We can be prejudiced. We can have somebody, like I looked up some more examples and I'll be as quick as I can, but like prejudice will result in a feeling of frustration, irritation, discomfort, and even anger, targeted to the person who got the insult. And so that's prejudice, but in today's terms, we understand that to be racist. Whereas something that is racist, for example, like the word nigger, for example, basically, we know that that's attached to, we know that was started, unfortunately, during the time of slavery. And now, today, it includes, the idea that black people are savages, dangerous brutes, prone to criminality, that we lack morals, or that we're compulsively hypersexual, and that we're stupid and lazy. Now, everybody that uses that word might not think all of those things, but as an African-American, Scott, we constantly run from those narratives. So I give that word as an example to say that the narratives exist, and that those narratives are more important than a simple definition that we may argue over in a dictionary. And this this approach by sociology is one that people would like to dismiss and kind of say, oh, well, that's academic, when it's actually speaking to the reality that we must start from. The last thing I'll say on the reverse racism aspect, as you've already heard me say it a million times, and it was backed up by, I guess, this article that you read, I've always said, having studied this intensively since college, there's not one example of a reverse racism happening in a systematic way. You may have individuals, like we had on RaceHaven one time, say, well, there was this job that when I was applying for that job, I found out after I didn't get hired, they were hiring no whites. And so for that man individually, I respected that he would feel like, wow, this is reverse racism, because I found out that they were hiring no whites at that point. And I get that from him from an individual standpoint, but when you put that in a systematic context, if in fact the situation he said, and I can only go by what his situation, so I won't doubt his situation. But if that actually happened to him, what he's unable to contextualize, and I don't expect him to because it happened to him individually, but what he's unable to contextualize, that if a company had got to the point where they were no longer hiring whites, then I can actually easily go look at the history of that country that company without ever knowing anything about it and find out they probably had a long history where they were hiring no minorities whatsoever. So if that company decided, not by the minorities that were in the company, but if the owners in that company decided we're at a point where to get some inclusion, we need to only hire, some minorities, that's just, it speaks to the long history. But for that individual white person who found that out, he'll say, wow, there's reverse racism in our country. It still does not exist.
Right. And that speaks to, in my mind, just, again, our history and the miseducation of Americans, because if all Americans grew up and they've truly learned American history authentically and understood that because of years and years and years of discrimination and exclusion, then they wouldn't have these knee-jerk reactions when policies like the one you just explained, which is like an affirmative action type policy, comes down to foster inclusion. Inclusion and affirmative action would have never been necessary if we didn't have so many years of exclusion. And all of the resources and wealth concentrated within one group, which is still that way. Majority of the resources and wealth in this country are still held by European Americans. So, unfortunately, it seems unfair to those individuals, but, it's just an unfortunate part of our past. And it's, we have a lot of work to do going forward to continue to educate, new generations. And I know that's happening on certain levels, but it definitely needs to happen more, as you both stated. One of the things I want to bring to the forefront is this quote by Albert Einstein that I think speaks to the things that we're saying. And also it speaks to what you just said about the what is it, dictionaries. And I'm sorry, I'm having trouble remembering things, but dictionaries, like what you said, like people have a hard time realizing that even dictionaries were biased in the way they were written, and how everything in the history of this country comes from a disposition of white supremacy. And that's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow, to think, man, I know what I'm reading in the dictionary is true. I know that what I read in my history book is true, and that's the viewpoint of the world. And what people may not realize is while what you're reading may be true, it's limited. It doesn't provide a broad enough scope of history, et cetera. So with that being said, Einstein had this quote where he said, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it.
Wow.
No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And that's what I'm pounding on the table, trying to help people realize in all the work that I do, where some people may say, Scott, you're just being difficult, or, you're being, you're being like confrontational, or, just the things that I do, just something small to some people, like saying European American versus saying white. I don't use white in my everyday language anymore because of the research I've done, and I understand that, race in general is a social construct. I don't use the word white and I don't use the word black, okay, because I understand that they're fake. They mean nothing, right? So they have no academic or sociological or anthropological or, any research-based or historical fact other than what was made up.
Hey, Scott,
okay.
Let me throw in, if you don't mind, I always like to explain what you just said, because I don't want people hearing. Yeah, I don't want people hearing you saying, well, this is something that Scott in his intellectualness, I don't even know if that's a word, has come up with. There's no black and white, whatever. But let's give a quick story to where black and white come from, and we can go back to where you were. Basically, people don't realize this, but there was no black or white race before the transatlantic slave trade. Didn't exist in the world. So when you read history, you will never see things put in the context of black and white before you come to America. Nowhere in history can you find it, because as you said, they were social constructs that were created when it became time to demonize and and deem one group inferior to another. So that was something that was created during colonial times by the elite of this country to ensure that blacks and whites wouldn't come together, because there were plenty of African Americans Africans, to be fair, that were brought to this country and actually experienced indentured servitude as well as whites in this country initially. And so quite often in those small colonies and things of that nature, sometimes they will say, well, we don't like the treatment of of our person that we're indentured to. They will come together sometimes and violently get out of that situation. And so when it became a little more prevalent, the elite, in a sense, came up with the social construct of race to ensure that poor whites and African Americans would not come together by making them superior to the enslaved Africans. It created this dynamic web of police itself, and we've been going through it ever since, particularly in this country in the colonial times during the transatlantic slave trade. That's when that concept was created.
Right, and even to go a little bit deeper as well, there were some scientists, European scientists, during the time of something called eugenics, and they also came up with the concept of, white supremacy way back then, and they basically, they were like false philosophers and scientists and anthropologists back then that came up with these, this concept that Europeans were the dominant, race.
Right.
So all these different things, and again, for those who are listening, I definitely, challenge you to go ahead and do some research on these things. So with that being said, the reason why, I take the time to make these changes in my language and do different things like that, because again, I believe that we have to change our level of consciousness. And the reason why I think it matters, that people know the definition of racism, and that we get to, speaking, speaking these truths, is because we have to raise our level of consciousness. Ultimately, I believe that that's what has to be done if we're going to solve the problems, that we face today. So, I wanted to throw that Einstein definition out there. But both of you, said some things that, made a lot of sense and add a lot of context to, the things that we're discussing. And, it's just, just moving the dialogue forward. And before I jump to, our solution segment, I want to ask John. John, did you have anything else you want to maybe add, or did you have any thoughts based on what Montoya and I just shared?
No, it all makes sense. And like I said, I'm not here trying to eliminate or minimize the past. So I think the dialogue has been very healthy and very productive. So I have nothing that I could add that would make it better, only potentially worse. So please continue.
Okay. Okay. And when you say, I just want to make sure when you say potentially worse, you mean just something off beat. You're not saying that you're holding anything back, right?
No, I'm saying,
okay.
Trust me, you know me well enough. If there was something that bothered me or that I felt compelled to interject, I would do it. I'm saying I absolutely think it's been extremely productive so far, so please continue.
Okay, perfect. So I guess in getting to solutions, my question would be, I like to close out each show with a solution segment where we speak to solutions. But with being honest, this is where I'm going to challenge you guys today, because, man, when you talk about solutions, in terms of, the topics that we're discussing right now, on one level, we can say, yeah, it's simple, on what the solutions are. You just got to listen and, have dialogues like this. But on the flip side, I come to realize is that we're dealing with just ideologies. And everything that we've discussed today, the definitions I've given, for some people, they're going to make all the sense in the world because of your ideologies. And it sucks. Like, when it comes to politics, I don't claim any political affiliation because I just use common sense. I despise the concept of people are of this political belief, so they think along these lines, and they're of that political belief, so they think along these lines. I despise that, because with that tells me that people are rigid in their thinking, and that if something falls outside of what they politically believe, then they can't accept it. And that bothers me. It's like everyone's mind is closed. So I'm always optimistic about, working towards solutions, and the work has to be done, and it will continue to be done. And that's the reason why we take time out of our busy lives to do a show like this. But when we get into the solution segment, I want to read something to you and also to our listeners. And then I'm going to challenge you, Montoya, and you, John, to offer up solutions within this context of conservatives and liberals. So politically speaking, the same website and the same Dr. Cole, she wrote something called Racial Projects. And what she says is this. She gives a political framework in the way that what she calls neoconservative people think about these racial things and how liberal people think. My thing is, how do you come to solutions when you have people who are stuck in these thought processes? Can we truly come to solutions? So in the neoconservative what she calls racial projects, okay? So this is what Dr. Cole writes. Politically speaking, neoconservative racial projects deny the significance of race, which produces colorblind racial politics and policies that do not account for the ways in which race and racism still structure society. For example, legal scholar and civil rights attorney Michelle Alexander demonstrates in her book, The New Jim Crow, how the seemingly race-neutral war on drugs has been waged in a racist way due to racial biases in policing, legal proceedings, and sentencing, all of which result in the vast overrepresentation of Black and Latino men in U.S. prisons. This colorblind racial project represents race as inconsequential in society and suggests that those who find themselves in prison are simply criminals who deserve to be there. It thus fosters the quote-unquote common sense notion that Black and Latino men are more prone to criminality than are white men. This kind of neoconservative racial project makes sense of and justifies a racist law enforcement and judicial system, which is to say it links race to social structural outcomes like rates of incarceration. So I've heard and I've read conservative sites and outlets state that the reason why American jails are overflooded with minorities is because minorities commit more crimes. It's literally that plain and simple. It is that quote unquote black and white. They commit more crimes. They're more prone to criminality. That's why there's more of them in jail. Now, in contrast, liberal racial projects recognize the significance of race and foster activist-oriented state policies. Affirmative action policies operate as liberal racial projects in this sense. For example, when the admissions policy of a college or university recognizes that race is significant in society and that racism exists at individual, interactional, and institutional levels, the policy recognizes that applicants of color are likely to have experienced many forms of racism throughout their schooling. Because of this, they may have been tracked away from honors or advanced placement classes. They may have been disproportionately disciplined or sanctioned as compared with their white peers in ways that impact their academic records. This is why Black and Latino students are underrepresented at colleges and universities. So, by factoring in race, racism, and their implications, affirmative action policies represent race as meaningful and assert that racism shapes social structural outcomes like trends in educational achievement, and thus race should be taken into account in the evaluation of college applications. A neoconservative racial project would deny the significance of race in the context of education, and in doing so would suggest that students of color simply do not work as hard as their white peers, or that they are perhaps not as intelligent, and thus race should not be a consideration in the college admissions process. So I provide that long-winded background and framework because I think it says so much. And when we get to solutions, the solution segment in this dialogue and how it's challenging me, and I wanted to present that framework because I'm assuming there's going to be a challenge to you as well, but I think that us thinking together in this way will help our listeners as well as help us. And so the question is, was considering these what Dr. Cole calls racial projects, and someone else actually coined the term, and she just used it here. How do you foster solutions in a society that has these polarizing frameworks in the way they think, and conservative and liberal? So I'm just going to throw it out there. I said a lot. I hope it makes sense. But if you guys can just put forth your best thinking on what I just said, it will definitely be appreciated. So whoever wants to go first, who wants to jump in, just jump in.
I mean, the way you started, you kind of said, that what we're doing here, I think you, to a certain extent, while you said the work will be done, but there's a level of frustration, that comes with, doing the work in this manner. Right now, again, I know you said you wanted to challenge us to go further with it after hearing these, in the sense how these racial projects, in a sense, are set up. I think they're both very accurate in the perspectives. I will, maybe I am closed-minded to the idea that we can move further or faster than we're moving, when I understand that, unfortunately, the racial projects that you see that are there and very evident, and people are deep-seated in their beliefs, when I realize that ultimately we're up against the context of the power of the media, and John spoke to this earlier, when you, in fact, are inundated with narratives that all they do is reinforce those deep-seated beliefs, and it makes people, actually reject something that is very factual because they've been led to believe something for so long. And so I think, unfortunately, it requires, the work that we're doing now, while it may seem hard and moving, as you said, I know you're dedicated to it and you won't stop doing it. But at the same time, the beauty of the Internet is, in a sense, the great equalizer, as you said earlier, about the idea that people can actually drive some of this dialogue. It's just going to continue to take, let's blow up RaceHaven. Let's, if the mass media won't ever have RaceHaven on TV doing what we're doing here, we're definitely in a world in which we can continue to tell people about, RaceHaven, and that's doing this work, to the extent that if it becomes big on the Internet, maybe the bigger stations eventually have to pay attention to. So I think it's just, it takes people that are dedicated to it, like yourself. I mean, with me, with my mental dialogue community, I don't make no calls about I'm focused on the African-American community, but you know enough about me in a way that these same things that we say, whites think, you and I both talk about how us African-Americans, we believe it too, and foster some of those same systematic beliefs because we're taught the same things. So, my efforts are for African-Americans to lose sight of this thinking and not have the self-hatred that, in a sense, perpetrates some of the things that we see within our own community. So you understand my work, and you know that it's ultimately for the overall good. But at the same time, I really believe, unfortunately, and John may come up with something more brilliant than I can, but I think it's going to require spreading the word on this type of work in a world that gives us a chance, because we do have the Internet.
That makes sense. John?
Love the perspective. I will throw out there two words that hopefully will bring us towards solutions dialogue, but it's two words that I think they're ignored on purpose by so many people, and I'll give you the reasons why I think they're important. Personal choice. I think we as a society, I'm only 48 years old, so I'm not trying to make it sound like I'm 100 years old, but I have watched in my 48 years people do everything within their power to shirk the responsibility and the personal accountability for anything. And I'm talking African American, European American, lazy people that are just trying to point the finger at everything other than themselves, not just for the circumstances they're in, but so they didn't have to do anything along the way down. And I'll speak specifically just about white people, because that's who I am. and I can't be accused of being racist if I'm talking about white people. I have, Scott, in my career, watched people complain about things that they could control but were just too lazy or just didn't care about. And I'll go back to being a little kid when it was time to try out for baseball. Back then, we had baseball tryouts, and magically some kids got cut and didn't get selected. And you know what? That forced us at age 9 or 10 to either practice and get better or not be picked again next year. And the same thing with basketball. And I'm not saying whether this is right or wrong. I'm just simply saying it has contributed to what we now face today. So fast forward. All of a sudden now we have the society that every kid has to be picked and every kid has to play an equal amount of time. Well, what message are we sending to people that you don't have any personal accountability, therefore you don't have to make the choice to practice and to be good? And I'm using very simple examples of little kids playing sports to keep it from becoming, inflammatory. But we can apply that same mentality to everything. And the reality is we've become a society that feels entitled and that feels that we have the right to sit back and demand stuff but never take responsibility or accountability. And then in the wrong hands, those feelings and that luxury, we'll call it, that society now grants on everybody has created the world where we just get to blame everyone and everything for our problems. Now, does that somehow negate what we were talking about earlier? No. I absolutely believe that there's racial bias. Anybody that says they're not is an idiot and is just lying to themselves. Every single human being on some level discriminates, but that does not make them evil people. But the bottom line is we have to find a way to, as a group, say we recognize it and we're going to try to solve it. We're going to try to make a louder voice. We talked earlier. I don't ever believe that you can stamp out completely anything, but we can come together with a more positive message and make a louder noise and drown out the stupidity and the ignorance. So I'm just going to throw it back out there. I know that was a 5-minute, monologue, but I want to throw it back out there and say, where does personal choice come into things? Because I personally make the choice. I have the same capacity to get angry. I have the same capacity to be violent. But I also have the trigger in my head that says, you wouldn't last one day in prison, so don't be stupid. But there are some people that I have met and that I know personally that don't really have a fear of prison. They don't really have a fear of getting arrested or going to jail. So their personal choice is not nearly as succinct as mine, because I have a very real concern. I wouldn't last there. I don't have that backbone or that history that says, I could survive in prison for 60 days or for 5 years. So,
hey, John, if I could just, I'm sorry to interject, man. I know this is the end of the show, man, but this is unfortunately such a bone of contention. I won't go too hard with it, man. But there's a way that you could be raised that you could think just like that, and that you could have a life experience that, as you say, that those people don't have an issue with going to jail. There is a life experience that you could have experienced that would have absolutely make you think the same way. And you could take it outside of America. I could stick you and raise you in the Philippines. You can grow up that way, and you will think just like that person. That's the reality. When you ask where does that word personal responsibility apply, I'll tell you where it applies. It applies in the personal responsibility. If we're going to own up to the definitions that we just spoke to, if we're going to say, well, yes, we have to do something about the systematic, well, once we start relying on personal responsibility, we don't address the systematic at all. I'm not saying to dismiss personal responsibility whatsoever. Scott will tell you, if you go hear me speak and I mentor kids, all I speak about when I'm mentoring those African-American community, those kids, is what they should be doing to become excellent at whatever they do. That's all I speak to them. But I know that alone, without us as a country owning our history and even wanting to address, when that word comes into play, I know immediately what's not going to happen is what can we do about the systematic issues. They never get addressed when that becomes the buzzword. That's being honest
wait
with
a
you,
minute.
brother.
But Montoya, that's an assumption you just made. I didn't say it's either or. I didn't say it's one or the
No,
other.
I get it. That's what
said
happens,
we
though,
have
brother.
to bring both.
Yeah, well, like I said, when you say you ask where does it play a part? I just gave you the answer to where it plays a part. I definitely don't like to have either or conversations. I definitely am not that man. But I'm just letting you know. You asked the question, where does it play?
No,
and I'm
that's
just telling
great.
you, when it plays out very hard in this way, as a country, we never address the systematic. That's why the systematic has been able to prevail for so long. That narrative of systematic versus responsibility, I know you don't mean it in that way, but when you ask the question, where does it lie? I'm giving you an answer that you could be raised in an environment in which you would feel the exact same way. You're not considering what values were placed into you and what life experiences you had to actually come to the conclusion that you did. Again, I'm not foregoing or telling anybody to do whatever they want. And again, I never tell kids to do anything but do right. But there is a systematic situation that will keep the numbers the exact same, and personal responsibility alone won't change it. And again, I know that's not what you're saying. I know that's not what you're saying, but I'm just saying. I'm sorry.
Let's not get back in. Go ahead, John.
No, I said that's perfect, but that's exactly what I'm saying. I interjected it because it hasn't been brought up in our entire conversation. Now it is, and now you're addressing something powerful, that it has to be a combination of both. If we only focus on what is
Absolutely.
and not interject the personal responsibility, then it allows people to just keep pointing the finger. So I'm grateful. I'm saying I'm grateful that you bring it in and you merge it as two different, it's not a versus, it's in harmony. So I'm grateful for that. But that's why I brought it up, because it's something that really is not big in the public domain anymore. It's something that's been kind of almost erased or stifled. So I'm grateful.
I would disagree. I think all we do narrative-wise is talk about one or the other. I hear both all the time. All the time. That's the world I live in. I hear them all the time.
Well, that's why we're on this call, and that's why we're doing this radio show, because
Absolutely.
I don't hear it anymore, and I'm comfortable enough with Scott, and obviously if he's brought you on here, I'm comfortable enough talking about it with you, but it's really something that I believe we have to blend in, because, again, I'm talking about my son and playing sports. I'm not trying to make this inflammatory.
Yeah.
I have a problem where if my son doesn't want to practice and be good enough, let's just call it what it is. He doesn't want to play baseball because they stuck him in the outfield and he was bored. And I said, well, then you have to practice. You have to want to get better. And he said, well, I don't want to. I said, well, then don't complain that they're sticking you in the outfield. So that's just one tiny little example, but it's that whole concept. Does he now deserve the right to be a baseball player? No. He doesn't want to do the work to get picked, to be selected, to be good enough. And that just, again, is going to set a bad tone for him. If he continues with that kind of coddling by society, he's not going to amount to anything, because he's not going to be taught to work hard to be good at anything. And I'm using my son as an example so nobody can be offended.
So what's the race base? Tie it in. Bring it home to the race side of it, like how you see personal responsibility being a part of the solution for the things we just discussed. So can you make that connection? Because I'm not seeing the connection right now between that example and the solutions we're seeking racially. Can you bring that home for me?
Sure. Well, we talked about jails and prisons, and we talked about schools and education. Mm-hmm. There are just, unfortunately, patterns that have developed. And again, I'm saying that systematically things need to change. Historically, we can't repeat the same mistakes. But there are some families in this country, both African American and European American, where education is not considered important. So, again, whether it's a little white kid or a little African American kid, if the parents are saying education doesn't matter, then that child is not going to have the same devotion to education that, the three of us may have had. The point is, that kid now doesn't excel in school and doesn't have the same opportunities to go get a college education. Same thing if the parents, again, if they don't respect law and order. They don't respect whatever, and they grow up watching the kids grow up watching their parents, cheat, steal, smoke pot, they're drunk, whatever. The kid's going to grow up with that as their pattern. So all I'm saying is we at some point take personal choice and personal responsibility that how we're raising our kids or how we were raised is going to have a big influence, and it's not just quote unquote systematic. It has to have some form of we have to make a decision.
Well, this is interesting because this is a whole show. And I'm going to take notes on this because we're going to do a whole show on systemic versus personal responsibility. That is an entire show because what you're saying right now, John, it's interesting because you're kind of like towing the midline between what I just explained, what I just read, between the whole liberal project and the neoconservative project. What you're saying is kind of you're in the middle, whereas you're saying that personal responsibility may be the reason why Black and Latino students are underrepresented at colleges and universities, and I'm reading that That was a quote that I just read. And you're saying that it may be personal responsibility may be the reason why the high rates of incarceration for African Americans and Latinos are there. It's not just the system; it's also personal responsibility. However,
I'm saying they both contribute. Yeah, they both. I'm not saying it's one. Don't get me wrong. I'm saying they both contribute.
Okay. Well, you know what? And just for the sake of time, we'll leave it there. We're going to come back to this though, because I'm telling you, that is a show in itself. I have so much to say about that. Because that leads to us really digging deeper and going into the root of some of those things. And I guess I just want to just close out by saying one last point is interesting because poverty in itself, no matter the race, because these things absolutely these two examples in themselves affect low income European Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans at a very high level, and poverty itself is systemic. So when we talk about why does that parent value smoking pot and doesn't have a job, et cetera, I mean, we go into a whole other space, but those things are needed. Those conversations need to be had. So I'm going to table it, and the three of us are going to get back together, and we're going to have that conversation because I think that our listeners, would gain value from us having it because it'll take us places that I think we all need to go. So, man, I appreciate both of you, for setting aside some time today to have this dialogue. And the cool thing about dialogue is that, you just never know where it's going to go because we all bring our individual, perspectives to the table. And I think that this one went in some really interesting places. I hope our listeners got a lot out of it. So, again, I just want to say thank you to Montoya Smith and John Costino. And I want to ask you guys to just let our listeners know how they can connect with you and your work. So we'll start with you, John. How can our listeners connect with you and your work?
The easiest way to connect with me, Scott, is I have a Facebook page. My email address is just my name, johncostino@yahoo.com. But I'm pretty much real open on Facebook, always happy to hear from anybody. And I want to thank you for inviting me on the show. I want to thank Montoya for, a tremendous contribution and great perspectives. And I'm always happy to be here, Scott.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, and Montoya, Could you share with our listeners?
Yep, same with me. Simply, Facebook is the best way. You can go to facebook.com and look up Mental Dialogue. It's an opportunity to like that page. Or you can find me personally. You have to actually put in montoya.smith.9, and that takes you to me. So you can kind of see me both places or whatever. Just reach me on Facebook. The email is montoya.mentald, as in dog, @gmail.com. And I also want to thank John. Scott, I always love people that are willing to have these conversations because I think that's so necessary. So, John, appreciate your perspective and thoughts as well today. And thank you, Scott, for having this dialogue. And as you said, we ended on a whole nother conversation. I knew that, absolutely. So I definitely want to be a part of that conversation.
Oh, no doubt. We will definitely. As soon as this call is over, I'll definitely be putting that on my notes, and we'll get back together. And just to clarify, John Costino is Costino, on Facebook, and also for everyone that has a Facebook page, if you just go to the search bar and put in Mental Dialogue, you'll find Montoya and all of his work there. So I want to, again, thank all of our listeners. And I want to ask you to, be sure to subscribe to the Race Haven podcast on iTunes or Stitcher Radio apps so that you never miss the dialogue. If you love this show, please leave us a review on both iTunes and Stitcher podcast apps. This will help us to gain more visibility for the show and more listeners. Also, we want to hear from you. So if you have a Facebook page, go to our Race Haven group and comment on this show. Or on my personal page or John's or Montoya's, wherever you see this show being advertised, if you can leave some thoughts and comments below, we would love to hear from you. You could also visit RaceHavenblog.com and leave comments and questions about today's show there. And you can join our online community by joining the Race Haven Facebook group simply by searching Race Haven, and you'll find the group there. If today's episode resonated with you, please share the podcast link on social media and with your friends. And finally, I'd like to close out by stating the mission and purpose of Race Haven. Race Haven is a safe place for people from diverse ethnic, religious, cultural, and political backgrounds to bring their race-based perspectives, questions, assumptions, frustrations, and experiences to engage in thoughtful, honest dialogue in an effort to transcend race in America. Remember, we are all smarter when we think together. Peace.
This episode of Race Haven was sponsored by the 5 for Friends app. 5 for Friends is available for download on iPhone and Android devices now. Have you ever played phone tag with a friend for weeks because you both were so busy? Do you put off calling family and friends for fear of being tied up on the phone for too long? If yes, then 5 for Friends is the solution. It's a mobile app that makes it easy and convenient to verbally keep in touch with family and friends, 5 minutes at a time. Visit 5forfriends.com or your app store to download. It's the number 5, FOR, Friends. Try it today.
Thanks for listening to the Race Haven Radio Show and Podcast. Be sure to visit www.racehavenblog.com to comment and learn more.
Looks like you already visited At Home this spring. The patio looks great, but why the makeover?
Because we're hosting the block party, because Sunday dinner's moved outdoors, because, Hunter's graduation and Emily's baby shower, and because sometimes I can just sit back and enjoy it.
Explore At Home's expanded selection of patio decor, like cushions starting at $9.99 and garden themes from modern to coastal. At Home, the home decor superstore. Any style, any budget, any reason to redecorate. Visit one of our 6 Atlanta area At Home superstores today.
When we go out to eat, we never agree on where to go.
I want burgers! Pizza.
Tacos it is.
The one thing we do agree on is we all want unlimited high-speed data. That's why we switched to Metro PCS.
Stop by Metro PCS with the whole family and get 4 lines with unlimited LTE data for just $100, period. Metro PCS. Wireless. Figure it out.
Coverage not available in some areas. Offers require port and of number not currently active on T-Mobile network. During congestion, the fraction of customers using more than 35 gigs per month may notice reduced speeds. Video streams at up to 40p. No tethering. See store for details and terms and conditions.